So we are going to continue taking our notes regarding the broken promises following World War II between the European powers and those living in the Middle East. First, leading up to the conflict known as World War I, we see the Ottoman Empire is controlling a wide swath of land spreading from northern Africa, from the Algiers, Tripoli, Cairo, all the way west to Baghdad and parts of modern-day Iran, even spreading as far north into Greece and Bulgaria in Europe. So they control a wide area of land incorporating a variety of different cultures and ethnic groups. But leading up to World War I, the Ottoman Empire had been really designated as the sick man in Europe because they had been losing land to Europeans since the early 1800s. As you can kind of see on the map right here, they had lost lands in southern Hungary in 1807. They had lost parts of Greece in the late 19th century. They were losing parts of North Africa in the late 19th century. So they really had begun to fall apart well before World War I. And as they fell apart, we see different ethnic groups begin to resist the control of their multi-ethnic empire living in Ankara. And we see groups like the Serbians, Romanians, Greeks, Bulgarians, to name only a few, that wanted to establish their own state. And during this conflict, we see reformers within the Ottoman Empire wanting a constitution because they saw that as a way to placate these ethnic groups, but the important religious and government leaders did not, for a variety of reasons. One, they didn't want to admit defeat, they didn't want to admit their decline, but also they didn't want to give up their own power because the religious and government leaders had an incredible amount of power in the Ottoman Empire. So by giving it to a constitution, or giving up into a constitution, they would effectively give up their reign and their grip on the empire. And as we can see in this map, if you look, all the different colors represent different ethnic groups residing in parts of the Ottoman Empire. And we see that throughout I know it includes other areas like Iran and Afghanistan that were not part of the Ottoman Empire, but we see that these areas are incredibly diverse. So the Ottoman Empire had a very difficult time during its reign or authority to control these groups and to make sure everyone was happy. So their demise was, I wouldn't say inevitable, but pretty close to inevitable once we get into the 19th century. And then with World War I, 1914, we really see the demise of the Ottoman Empire accelerating at a much greater rate. And the biggest reason is the fact that they sided with the Central Powers. So they sided with Germany and Austria-Hungary, who we know in hindsight lost World War I, but that's not necessarily why the Ottoman Empire lost their territory. We see that the Allied powers had made promises to both Jewish factions of their societies and Arabs living in the Middle East to give them land, to give them statehood following World War I, if those groups and those people supported them in World War I in an effort to pull them away from the Ottoman Empire and support the Allied powers. So you see them, or the British and the French, were making these promises that they would never really be able to hold up. So when you see the Central Powers end up losing the war, the British and the French had no intention of honoring their promises to the Arabs, and to a lesser degree the Jewish population, because they wanted to maintain their control and influence in the area. Where we see the British taking control over modern-day Iraq, the Transjordan, and the area of Palestine. We see the French taking over areas, the areas of Syria and Lebanon. So we see in the two maps below how the French and the British sought to divide up the Middle East into these areas that they could control effectively. And we see one of the examples of the promises that were made by the British was the McMahon-Hussein letters, where the British promised a Arab politician, the Sharif of Mecca, that they would give land and statehood to the Arabs in exchange for their help in fighting the Ottoman Empire. But we know that with the Sykes-Picot Agreement that didn't happen, and that promise was negated and kind of cut short. So we see that in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was a secret agreement between the French and the British primarily, and then bringing in the Russians and the Italians later on. But we see that as an agreement between the British and the French to divide up parts of the Middle East into these spheres of influence. And if we remember from our unit on China, spheres of influence being areas that they could control and they could have influence over economically and politically, but not really established as a colony. But also importantly, that they agreed on these areas so they, as European powers, would not come into conflict and not fight each other. And after battling during World War I and the bloodshed and the destruction that they saw and that everyone witnessed during World War I. So we see with one of the areas that the British took control during or after World War I under the Sykes-Picot Agreement was the British Mandate of Palestine. That included the areas of Palestine and was known as Transjordan. And the biggest problem with their control of the Mandate of Palestine was that they had made, during the war, the British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour had made an agreement with, or had communicated with Lord Rothschild, a British leader in the British Jewish community and the Zionist movement, to support a Jewish state following World War I. So we see Britain takes the Mandate of Palestine after World War I, according to the Sykes-Picot Agreement. They betray, them and the French, betray the Arabs, and the Arabs, as we've seen today, did not forget that betrayal, and they still are very bitter towards the betrayal of the British and the French. But we see even though Jews and other Zionist leaders begin to immigrate to Palestine as the promised land, or the land that was promised to them by the British in the Balfour Declaration, that we don't see an actual state being created, or even the support for the creation of a state by the British government until well after World War II. So we see that from the end of World War I through the end of World War II, that this area had kind of lived in a period of limbo where they didn't have self-control, or they didn't have their own states, they didn't have their own nations, but they were also separated from the Ottoman Empire and the empire that had controlled them previously. So it is, as we'll see next time, it is a interesting dynamic that ultimately led to the conflict that we see with in modern Middle East between Israel and Palestine / the Arab world.